Hi. So this video is just going to be about this one question from Prep Test 24, Section 2. It's question 21, and it's a logical reasoning question. So the first thing that I do whenever I get a logical reasoning question is read the question stem. So in this case, the question stem reads, which one of the following, if assumed, allows the argument's conclusion to be properly drawn? So if you're familiar with the various different types of questions, you will know that this is a sufficient assumption question. We're being asked which of the answer choices, if we added it to the premises of this argument, would get us to the conclusion, would allow that conclusion to be properly drawn. So what we'll find when we read through the argument is, first of all, it will be an argument, which means that there will be a conclusion and there will be support offered for that conclusion. But we'll also discover that it's a flawed argument. So the support offered for the conclusion is not sufficient. This we can also refer to as the gap. So the gap between the support and the conclusion. The correct answer will fill that gap in such a way that we can get all the way to the conclusion, that the conclusion will make sense on the basis of the support plus the correct answer. Okay, so typically for this type of question, we are going to be looking for some kind of gap or some kind of mismatch between the support offered and the conclusion. Often it will be the last premise before we get to the conclusion, or it will be the most relied upon premise based on the language that's used. So that premise might have a supporting indicator word, like the word since or because or for, or maybe it's the one immediately before we get to the conclusion sentence. And in the conclusion sentence, we have a conclusion indicator word like so or therefore. In this case, looking at the final sentence, I see the phrase, that is why. So the reasoning that they've offered before that sentence begins, that's the reason why they're stating their conclusion. So often there's going to be some kind of mismatch or gap between that key reasoning and their final conclusion. And that's what we want to fill with the correct answer. Okay. One other note, this is a type of assumption question. There are other types of assumption questions. The two main types are sufficient assumption and necessary assumption. And it is really valuable to be able to distinguish between those two. It's definitely going to help you get your accuracy up. So that's something I can discuss in another video. For our purposes here, we are looking for a sufficient assumption, and we know that adding it is going to get us to our conclusion. All right, let's get into the analysis of the stimulus. So a newspaper editor says that law enforcement experts, as well as most citizens, have finally come to recognize that legal prohibitions against gambling all share a common flaw. No matter how diligent the effort, the laws are impossible to enforce. Ethical qualms notwithstanding, when a law fails to be effective, it should not be a law. That is why there should be no legal prohibition against gambling. Okay, so the conclusion here is this bit of the last sentence. Okay, the beginning of that sentence is just kind of introducing the conclusion. So the conclusion is simply that there should be no legal prohibition against gambling. Why do they think that's the case? That's our support. So when a law fails to be effective, it shouldn't be a law, right? So we're getting from a law being ineffective to it shouldn't be a law. So clearly what they believe is that legal prohibitions against gambling fail to be effective, right? That's the link that they're making. However, we're going to have a problem with that. Nowhere in their premises do they directly state that legal prohibitions against gambling are ineffective. Okay, so if we go further back, we will see that they say that legal prohibitions against gambling share a common flaw, that flaw being that they're impossible to enforce. So they didn't specifically say that those laws are ineffective. They did say that they're impossible to enforce. So that's the gap here. Okay, so in this case, it's actually not the typical gap that we see, which is between that key premise toward the end of the argument and the conclusion. It's actually a gap between two of the premises, between legal prohibitions against gambling being unenforceable, and then if something's ineffective, it shouldn't be law. So they're trying to make this argument, and they're assuming that unenforceability equals ineffectiveness. Okay, so in order to fill that gap, we have to take what they've told us is true, which is that these laws are impossible to enforce, and we need to be able to link that to this principle that when a law fails to be effective, it shouldn't be a law. So that's a conditional statement. It's not that nothing should be a law, right? It's under certain conditions that we can say it shouldn't be a law. So when a law fails to be effective, then we can come to the conclusion it shouldn't be a law. So we have to meet that condition of ineffectiveness to get to our conclusion. And one way that we could draw that line is by saying, if it's impossible to enforce, then it must fail to be effective. Okay. So that's the exact kind of relationship that we want to have in the correct answer in order to fill that gap. I'm going to just go ahead and write that out. So what we want is this relationship that if a law is unenforceable, it therefore must be ineffective. Okay, the contrapositive of that statement is that all effective laws must be enforceable. So we're essentially saying that enforceability is a requirement for effectiveness. Okay. So if we look at answer choice A, it states that no effective law is unenforceable. This is exactly what we need. So if we were to reword that statement, it would mean the same thing for us to say all effective laws are enforceable, or to say if a law is unenforceable, it must be ineffective. Okay. So no effective law is unenforceable. If we look at all of the effective laws, we find that none of them are unenforceable, meaning that all of them are enforceable. So I'm just kind of repeating that same idea in multiple different ways so that you can kind of find one that feels intuitive to you, that makes sense to you. Okay. And so one thing that we do if these statements aren't easy to understand, if it's not clear what the sufficient condition is and what the necessary condition is within this statement, is that we work on that conditional reasoning skill. Okay. So in this case, there's a word that indicates conditional reasoning in this statement, which is the word no. And so that's something that I could notice. And one way to deal with that is to recognize that that's going to indicate a relationship of sufficiency. So a law being effective must guarantee something. And in this case, what does it guarantee? Well, it guarantees that that law is enforceable. If it's effective, it's going to be enforceable. Another way of dealing with it, and this is what I would call the 7-sage method, because that's how I came across it, is that we actually memorize groups of words, and the word no fits into group 4 out of the 4 groups that the 7-sage method designates. So with group 4 words, that indicates that we're going to take a term, negate it, and make it necessary. So in this case, we could take effectiveness or an effective law, negate it, make it the necessary condition in a statement, and unenforceable would become the sufficient condition. So that's how we would get, if it's unenforceable, it must be ineffective. Right, and since that's exactly what we want, A must be the correct answer. Right. I'm just going to talk about why B doesn't get translated the same way. So B states that all enforceable laws are effective. As a conditional statement, this would read, if a law is enforceable, it must be effective. Okay, if I know that a law is enforceable, I also know that it's effective. I could also state it as enforceability is a sufficient condition for determining effectiveness, or effectiveness is necessary for enforceability. But we're going to run into a problem with that, because in this argument, we don't know that this law is ineffective. We know that it's unenforceable. And negating the sufficient condition doesn't actually allow us to draw a conclusion, whereas negating the necessary condition does. So for this one, we need enforceability to be the necessary condition, because we know that these laws are not enforceable. They are impossible to enforce. So because we're negating enforceability, we want enforceability to be a necessary condition. And then we can go from it's not enforceable to it's not effective to it shouldn't be a law. Okay. So hopefully that makes more sense now. If you have any follow-up questions, please let me know.